So before I begin, there are just a few people that I have to thank. First, Suzanne Plendreau and Janet Harper at the Center for Black Music Research. I would also like to thank the staff at the Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Yale University, Jane Gottlieb of the Juilliard School, and my advisor, Dr. Joel Sachs. And finally, I have to thank my parents, and I can't believe my birth. My dad is here. I haven't seen him in 2 years. And my 2 sisters and their families.
It's wonderful.
Okay, so thank you.
Welcome.
Okay, so on that note, I will continue. It's hard to believe that I met Margaret Bonds just 2 years ago. At the conclusion of my second year in the DMA program at Juilliard, it was time to determine my dissertation topic. I knew that I wanted to pursue a subject that satisfied not only my musical interests, but also my interest in literature, African American history, and gender. So one of the books I checked out was Helen Walker Hill's From Spirituals to Symphonies, African American Women Composers and Their Music. As I perused the book for ideas, I kept returning to the chapter on Margaret Bonds, a woman whose career was influenced by the Harlem Renaissance, the Chicago Renaissance, and the Civil Rights Movement. A woman who, in the face of gender and racial discrimination, relentlessly pursued her passion for music. And finally, a woman who worked with one of the greatest literary minds of the 20th century, Langston Hughes. As a young classical musician myself, who could not have achieved what I have without the support of Black social and religious organizations, I felt an immediate connection with Bonds, and I had to learn more. Ballad of the Brown King remains one of Bonds' most frequently performed works. While there have been publications about Ballad of the Brown King, current analyses present only general overviews of the piece. In Black Women Composers, A Genesis, author Mildred Denby Green provides a general description of Ballad of the Brown King with respect to key relationships, texture, and harmony. Secondly, in her entry on Margaret Bonds in the International Dictionary of Black Composers, Deborah Hawkins provides a one-page overview of the work. And finally, in From Spirituals to Symphonies, while Walker Hill mentions Ballad of the Brown King and provides details about early performances, an in-depth analysis of the piece is simply outside the scope of the book. So without the aforementioned publications, my dissertation could not have come to fruition. However, a critical historical overview and detailed analysis of Ballad of the Brown King remains long overdue. As a recipient of the Presser Award in 2012, I have been able to expand my research on this topic to include the Margaret Bonds file in the Helen Walker Hill papers at CBMR, and the letters between Bonds and Hughes in the Hughes papers at Yale University. In my presentation today, it is my primary objective to initiate a discussion that examines critically the cultural factors that may have inspired Bonds and Hughes to dedicate Ballad of the Brown King to Martin Luther King Jr., and to later refer to Ballad of the Brown King as a work of propaganda. In her correspondence with Hughes, Bonds first mentions Ballad of the Brown King just a couple of weeks before the first premiere in 1954. On November 30th, Bonds writes, "From the response that's coming in, there should be quite a distinguished audience to hear the first performance of Ballad of the Brown King." In December of 1954, the first version of the piece was performed by the George McClain Choir at the East Side Settlement House in New York City. In From Spirituals to Symphonies, Walker Hill suggests that following the premiere, Bonds shelved the work. However, after the December performance, Bonds made revising Ballad of the Brown King her top priority. For on December 27, 1955, she writes to Hughes, Last night I couldn't sleep, so I analyzed what I must accomplish in 1956. Of course, I had so many women's chores to do that I had to discipline myself not to attempt too much. First, Brown King. Second, a chamber opera. And third, Job. Sometime during the year following the 1954 premiere, Bonds decided to orchestrate Ballad of the Brown King. For in that same letter, she writes, "It's the orchestration that really takes the time, and I want it all to be so fine that I can show it to the most distinguished conductors with no apology." However, in the letters, we do not read about the work again until February of 1960. On February 16th, Bonds writes to Hughes from New Haven, Connecticut. "The last two orchestral arrangements I did without a teacher, and she, Miss Betty Allen, says they sound well, so that means that I no longer have any fears about my orchestration. And eventually, the Ballad of the Brown King and all of the art songs will have orchestral accompaniment." For Bonds, Ballad of the Brown King was going to be her magnus opus, her crowning achievement that showcased her skills not only as a vocal composer, as she was primarily known, but also as a composer who was equally at ease with writing for the orchestral medium. Yet, for a work that seemed to mean so much to Bonds, it is still surprising that it took 6 years for the second version to materialize. One possible reason for this is that from 1954 to 1960, Bonds was exceptionally busy. Her compositions dating from this period include Songs of the Seasons, a 4-movement song cycle that was completed and premiered in 1955. In 1958, Bonds and Hughes collaborated on Shakespeare in Harlem. And in 1959, Bonds completed Three Dream Portraits, which was published that same year. Also during this period, Bonds increased her involvement with local cultural organizations. From 1950 to 1958, she served as the chair of a concert series at the Community Church of New York. In 1956, she established the Margaret Bonds Chamber Music Society, and on November 3rd of that same year, she presented its inaugural concert at Carnegie Hall. And finally, in 1957, Bonds volunteered at the Harlem Cultural Council and played a role in the founding of the Harlem Jazzmobile. And all of this she did while raising her daughter, Dion. As a wife, a mother, a composer, and educator, during this period, Bonds maintained a hectic schedule. Yet it is equally possible that she and Hughes put the work aside until 1960, when it became clear that Ballad of the Brown King might be more attractive to publishers if it was more explicitly linked to the civil rights movement. On August 19, 1960, Bonds writes to Hughes, "After turning into you, the Brown King is on its way again. I am happy I waited, for I understand the market so much better now, and am reconciled to it. It will be ready for performance by September 20th, and published for Christmas of 1961. I love it so very much, I know that the populace will likewise." Between the years of 1954 and 1960, the country experienced an unprecedented rising up of African Americans fighting for civil rights. On May 17, 1954, Chief of Justice Earl Warren rendered his decision for the Supreme Court case Brown versus Board of Education. He resolved that in the field of public education, that doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. While it would take years for African American students to share the classroom with their white neighbors, for example, 7 years after Brown versus Board, there's not a single black student who sat next to a white one in Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, and South Carolina, Warren's decision nonetheless meant that African Americans could demand civil rights with the law on their side. Following the Brown decision, the country began to witness increasingly publicized acts of civil disobedience. On December 1st, 1955, Ms. Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a segregated public bus in Montgomery. 4 days later, the Montgomery bus boycott began, and 99% of the city's African American commuters sought other means of transportation. The Montgomery Improvement Association was established to organize the boycott, and the young Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was chosen as its leader. On the eve before the boycott, thousands from the community gathered at the Holt Street Baptist Church. King declared, "And we are determined here in Montgomery to work and fight until justice runs down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream." From that evening onwards, King rose to the forefront of a burgeoning movement as its leader, one whose faith in nonviolent protest, powerful rhetoric, and unwavering tenacity would inspire Americans to join the movement. And 1 year after the end of the boycott in 1956, 9 African American students entered the all-white Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. The nation watched in horror at the city's determination to prevent desegregation in its public school. And the city of New York, where Bonds had been living since 1939, faced its own challenges. By the 1950s, New York had the largest black population in the United States. And while the civil rights movement was gaining momentum in the South, in New York City, the housing and educational systems were becoming increasingly segregated. While in her letters to Hughes, Bonds does not explicitly comment on this radically shifting of political and social landscapes, it is clear that she saw herself as part of a marginalized group of artists in the predominantly white field of classical music. In the December 27, 1955 letter, Bonds writes to Hughes, "I'm organizing the Negro composers so they can all promote together like the French cease. Dr. White, Boatner, William Lawrence are all for it, so the rest will in line." Bonds also viewed herself as part of a younger generation who owed much to those Harlem Renaissance artists who had broken down racial barriers in the arts. Towards the end of the letter, she asks, "Won't it make the older ones who will soon leave us feel good to know that there is an organization set up to perpetuate their contributions?" Bonds was conscious of the ongoing discrimination of African Americans in classical music. For just several days later, on December 30th, 1955, Bonds sends Hughes a copy of an article that she had written. It was titled, "Columbia Concerts Forced to Drop Negro Soloists on Shaw Chorale Southern Tour." On the article, she writes a short note that reads, "Langston, did you know about this? For fear someone else might not get around to writing it, I did." So we cannot be sure as to how actively Bonds participated in local civil rights events, but her attendance at the salute to A. Philip Randolph on January 24th, 1960 suggests that she may have done so, time permitting. Nevertheless, Bonds was an activist in her own right, as a teacher and member of various Black cultural organizations. In a letter to Hughes dating March 6, 1960, it is evident that Bonds saw the power in "it takes a village," and she wanted to encourage others to feel the same. In this letter, Bonds is bubbling with excitement over the success of Shakespeare in Harlem. Her name is listed as a supporter of the production, and she was very proud of that. She notes, "I was surprised to see Royce Atterbridge's name on our list of backers. The Negro race is growing up. We can do so much more for our people when we can join hands economically with others. I'm constantly hearing that we don't do enough for ourselves as a group." Around the time that Bonds and Hughes were preparing the new version of Ballad of the Brown King in 1960, Hughes himself renewed his relationship with the largest national civil rights organization, the NAACP. Hughes's career was launched with the publication of The Negro Speaks of Rivers in the 1921 June issue of Crisis. Despite his at times tenuous association with the NAACP, he publicly supported them from that moment onwards. In 1960, Hughes received a commission to write the authoritative history of the NAACP. And on June 26th of that same year, he received the Spingarn Medal, the highest honor given by the NAACP, at its 51st convention in Minneapolis. In his remarks, Hughes spoke eloquently about the deeply felt love for the culture of his people. There is so much richness in Negro humor, so much beauty in Black dreams, so much dignity in our struggle, and so much universality in our problems, in us, in each living human being of color. Hughes and Bonds shared this belief, as is evident in the works that challenged negative perceptions of African American identity in favor of the celebration of beauty in one's Blackness. With regards to Ballad of the Brown King, Bonds writes, "It's a great mission to tell Negroes how great they are." By 1960, Ballad of the Brown King was undoubtedly linked with the Civil Rights Movement. On August 24th, 1960, Bonds reports to Hughes, "And yesterday, she, who is referred to earlier in the letter as Virginia, she brought an interesting person, Maya de Los Angeles, who heads the King movement and expects to use Ballad of the Brown King, Christmas, for the King movement." And by the fall of that year, it is clear that Bonds was, at least in part, relying on the growth of the civil rights movement and organizations to help promote the upcoming December premiere of Ballad of the Brown King. On October 15th, 1960, she writes to Hughes, "On October 30th, at the Village Gate, the press will assemble for the cabaret for SCLC. Then they will be told of the Ballad of the Brown King." The world premiere of the revised and extended The Ballad of the Brown King took place on December 11, 1960, at the Clark Auditorium in the YMCA on 50th and 8th in New York City. The performance was dedicated to Martin Luther King Jr., and it concluded with the singing of Christmas spirituals. In an interview with Helen Walker Hill, Bonds' daughter Dionne Richardson recalled that the auditorium was jam-packed and that Bonds, who led the orchestra, received a standing ovation following the performance. Dionne and her friends were ushers for the concert, and everyone who could chipped in to make the performance possible, including a young Dorothy Red Moore who helped with copying the parts. Dionne remembered that in those days, Black Harlemites could be counted on to attend and support African American cultural events and activities. The December 1960 premiere of Ballad of the Brown King was nationally broadcast on a CBS program titled Christmas USA. As the work enjoyed successful national and international performances, Bonds grew even more confident in the work's message. In a letter from May 31st, 1961, Bonds writes to Hughes from Chicago, "Everything has been placed at my disposal here, and the Ballad of the Brown King, the right kind of propaganda, is off to a good start." In the rather lengthy postscript, Bonds concludes, "Trillions of people here saw the CBS broadcast December 25th, 1960. This is important to them. Your work and my work is vitally important to them, and our work is ourselves." This is the first letter in which Bonds refers to Ballad of the Brown King as a work of propaganda, and she uses the term again to describe the piece in a letter dating from July 7th, 1961. Here, Bonds tells Hughes that Irving Bunton is to conduct a performance of the piece, and he had informally requested insight into the work from Bonds and Hughes. While Bonds proposes to Hughes that he write a brief program note for this particular performance, she has some specific ideas that she would like Hughes to consider. She writes, "Please do not mention the music. The propaganda should take precedence, except that it might be good to mention the idiom. Most of the piece is based on 'Nobody knows the trouble I see.' Use your own judgment. I honestly want the propaganda of this piece to spread all over the world. Further, in composing of the music, I compared the March on Montgomery with the Ride of the Desert. Although Bonds had spent years revising and orchestrating Ballad of the Brown King, she wanted, as she states, the propaganda to take precedence. In other words, she saw the music as a means to the message of the text. In this letter, Bonds makes one other curious statement when she writes, "In composing of the music, I compared the March on Montgomery with the Ride of the Desert." Given that the music was written and completed in time for the 1960 premiere, the question remains, what March on Montgomery would this have been? Langston Hughes' poem is a lyrical retelling of the Christmas story, and Ballad of the Brown King is filled with contrasting, vivid images. The first section reads, "Of the 3 wise men who came to the king, one was a brown man, so they sing. Of the 3 wise men who followed the star, one was a brown king from afar." Hughes establishes the opposition between lightness and darkness, and this is represented by the star and the brown king, respectively. For many African Americans, it remains difficult to trace their exact roots, and Hughes's brown king also comes from the ambiguous afar. In Mary Had a Little Baby, Jesus' birth brings light into darkness, the cold of that miraculous night warmed by Christ's love. Hughes's phrase, "I so lost and lonely, nevermore shall he be alone," recalls the line, "I once was lost, but now am found," from the hymn Amazing Grace. And this surely would have been recognized by the audience at both premieres. In Could One King Have Been an Ethiop, Hughes addresses the mysterious origins of the Brown King. Perhaps he came from Ethiopia, or Egypt, or somewhere in Arabia. Nevertheless, Hughes creates a character in the Brown King who is regal and wise. In this poem, to be black is to be beautiful. Finally, in the 7th section, "O Sing of the King Who is Tall and Brown," the Brown King now stands tall as he journeys across the desert, following a star to see the Christ child whose birth promises peace and love. Allusions to the nonviolent protests, demonstrations, and marches that brought movement to the struggle for civil rights must be made. And note, it was this section of the poem that was added to the original version. Bonds' setting of Hughes' poem is divided into 9 movements, and over the course of the work, key relationships and the recurrence of motivic cells bring unity to this multi-movement piece. I'm going to take a pause here because I have prepared a lot of musical examples that people need to see. And so I wonder if I could just prop my computer here.
Yes.
Because it has a big screen, and if people want to kind of come around.
We were able to get we got visuals up, we just couldn't get the PowerPoint. We actually had
You guys did, I did.
Yeah, but on yours we can, if you'd like to just show